Hello there, my name is Matt Beasley and this is the second of two videos on the long narrative poem The Eve of St Agnes by John Keats. Part 1 covered everything up until and including stanza 22, and this video will discuss everything from stanza 23 until the end of the poem. So far, we've covered the legend of St Agnes, upon whose ritual the poem is based, the influences on Keats, and, of course, the content of the poem so far. In terms of plot, we know that this is the 20th of January and that there is a party going on in a castle. A young lady called Madeleine is performing the ritual of St Agnes in the hope that she will have a vision of the man she is going to marry. Meanwhile, unbeknownst to Madeleine, her lover, a young man named Porphyro, has come to the castle in the apparent hope of catching a glimpse of her. Porphyro is an enemy of this household and the occupants would kill him upon sight, so Porphyro has to sneak in and, with some help from an old lady called Angela, manages to hide himself in a cupboard in Madeleine's bedroom. Porphyro is in position, Madeleine is approaching, and all that remains is to find out what happens when she enters the room. Which happens right at the beginning of stanza 23. And Madeleine is in such a hurry that the candle she's carrying is blown out and the smoke disappears into the pale moonlight in the room, an image which may well remind us of the smoke from the beadsman's censer in stanza 1. She's described here in a way which suggests she's already under the magical charm of the St Agnes ritual. Her breathing is elevated and her eyes are wide. It's cold in this room, and perhaps the frosted breath of her panting explains why Keats connects Madeleine at this point to spirits of the air. Or it could be that this is just an image which connects Madeleine with some otherworldly creature, as will happen a few times over the next few stanzas, as well as right at the end. She enters the room silently, not uttering a sound, because if she does, then the charm she believes to be under will be broken. But although no words are spoken, her heart, a word which is repeated twice, here and here, almost like a heartbeat, is voluble, which means talking fluently, which probably means that it's beating very quickly in anticipation of the vision she expects to have that night. The simile which ends the stanza reveals the emotional stress and strain that Madeleine is under, almost bursting with the desire to release, like a songbird, the feelings that have been building up all evening and yet unable to because of the rules of the ritual, and so the heart is stifled and the sounds die in her throat. There are a number of images in this poem which connect Madeleine with birds, and I'll be picking those out as we go through. The next stanza is a brilliant example of Keats's richly evocative and sensually descriptive powers. There's no distracting action in this stanza at all, and so Keats is able to take his time and set the stage ready for the climax of the poem. He's describing Madeleine's room, specifically a high window with 3 arches, which is surrounded by carved images of fruit, flowers, and bunches of knot grass. The glass in the window is decorated or diamonded with countless stained glass images, and Keats compares the intricacy of these images with the patterns of a moth. And you'll probably notice that this stanza, along with the examples later on, feature several of these hyphenated words, almost as if Keats is trying to cram in as much detail as he can. Now, before I can go any further, I need to explain something about what heraldry is. And if you do an image search, then it'll bring up images like this. So heraldry is the system of coats of arms which traditionally were used to identify who you were and would feature on shields, armour, or other items of clothing. And when you look at these images, you'll probably notice that certain colours seem to feature quite heavily, especially red and gold, and that's because heraldry follows a particular code of colouring known as heraldic tincture. And so, when you read this stanza, you need to imagine the full moon shining on this window with its heraldic images, and some of the coloured light will fall on the figure of Madeleine as she kneels to pray in the next stanza. But before we get there, let's just tidy up the rest of the description from stanza 24. So, the window is decorated with heraldic images and saints. A scutcheon, which I've highlighted here, is a coat of arms, and this appears in the stained glass window as a design on a shield with blood-red colouring, and this colour will appear several times over the coming stanzas, and so it's worth pointing out here, as its association with Madeleine creates a pattern of images suggestive of sacrifice and loss of virginity. I spoke in the first video on this poem about the significance of the moon and the number of times it appears in this poem. The moon is associated with femininity, sexuality and fertility, and so it is of course significant that the moon is shining through the window and the light is falling on Madeleine. And this is where the information I gave you just now on heraldry becomes more relevant. Remember that the dominant colour in heraldic tincture is red, which explains the warm gules which are falling on Madeleine's breast as she kneels down to pray for heaven's favour. And more red images appear with the rose bloom here, that red colouring on her hands as she presses them together in a sort of saintly posture. In the second half of this stanza, Madeleine is cast several times in the image of a saint. Firstly, by the silver cross that she's wearing here. Then by the glory, which is actually a silver ring of light, a bit like a halo. And finally, through Keats's comparison to her as looking like an angel, except for wings, who is dressed ready for heaven. Our attention is then directed to the voyeuristic actions of Porphyro, growing faint as he watches these preparations from his secret spot in the cupboard. The final line of the stanza reminds us of her purity as she kneels and prays, and Porphyro is clearly affected by what he sees, which explains why he's growing faint when he looks at her. He is pretty quick to recover, though, and in the first line of the next stanza, his heart revives. Madeleine's prayers are now over, and over the next few lines, Keats delivers more beautifully sensual description, this time of her undressing. He starts with her hair, which has been tied up with some decorative headpiece, the jewels in which have been warmed by her own temperature, and this is unclasped slowly, carefully, one by one, as we see the poet and presumably Porphyro lingering over the details. Next, there is her sweet-smelling bodice, which again, slowly, by degrees, creeps, rustling to her knees, until now her nakedness is half hidden. And the simile which I've identified here for you, compares Madeleine to another fantasy creature, a mermaid in seaweed. And I've spoken several times over these two videos about the merging of fantasy with reality in this poem, and there's no more explicit example of that theme than in the phrase which describes Madeleine as she dreams awake and starting to question, as she will do later on, what is real and what is not. Here, in her imagination, she believes she sees fair St Agnes in her bed, the saint upon whom the charm is based. And we can see how this theme is continued in the next stanza with the phrase wakeful swoon, which, combined with the allusion to poppies, which I've also identified here, creates the impression of a sleep which has been induced by unnatural means. The poppy flower is where the sleep-inducing drug opium is derived. And Keats isn't suggesting that Madeleine has taken opium, of course, but the effect of the St Agnes charm on Madeleine is the same as she enters a sleep which is blissful, soothing, restorative, and, of course, where fantasy and reality will combine. We've got the recurrent image of Madeleine being compared to a bird in the first line of this stanza as she, trembling with cold and possibly excitement, enters the chilly nest which is her bed. And Porphyro will use this image himself in stanza 38, so you might want to make a note to link these stanzas now. The next part of the stanza is a bit tricky, but the overall purpose here is to convey a sense that Madeleine, in her nest bed, is safe and peaceful, and Keats does this using a number of different images. Firstly, he describes her as havened here, which is a word meaning safety or shelter, and next we have clasped like a missile, and critics have interpreted this in different ways. The adjective swart, which is used here, means dark, particularly when describing skin colour, while paynim refers to people who do not follow the Christian religion. A missal is a prayer book, particularly in the Catholic faith, and so the overall image here is of the bed, holding and protecting Madeleine in the same way that a Christian would hold and protect a Catholic prayer book in the company of non-believers. The next line tells us that Madeleine is blinded, and this suggests that whatever good or bad is going on in the world, Madeleine is protected from it through the power and insensibility of sleep. And this image builds on the same idea expressed 2 lines previously. But for me, it's the final line which is the most interesting, because it's hard to escape the sexual connotations. I mean, why is it in nature that buds open to become flowers? It's to attract a mechanism by which the plant might pollinate and therefore reproduce. But look at what Keats does with the flower image here. The rose is shut to be a bud again. And on the one hand, this creates another image of peace and safety, and we can imagine Madeleine perhaps curling up herself in her chilly bed for warmth and comfort. But I think that there is also a warning in these lines. The flower to which Keats is referring is closed, and therefore any attempt to open it would be done by deception, enthrallment, or force, which is precisely why the word stolen is so interesting at the beginning of the next stanza. I mean, what do you think Keats had in mind when he writes this line? There's only one answer. Stolen to this paradise? He must be thinking of Milton's Paradise Lost, in which Lucifer is cast out of heaven, sent to hell for his betrayal, and attempted to overthrow God. And for revenge, Lucifer stole into Eden, an earthly paradise disguised as a snake, and ensured the ruin of Eve. So Keats strikes a deliberate connection at the beginning of this stanza between Porphyro and Satan, suggesting that he will betray Madeleine and ensure her shame and expulsion from the paradisic nest described in the previous lines. But Keats doesn't make it quite as clear-cut as this, and look, as literature students, you need to understand that ambiguity and difference of opinion are good things. My job here is just to explain the lines as well as I can. It's your job to decide which interpretation of the events you agree with. So how about the description of Porphyro as entranced, which appears literally in the same line where I've just suggested that he's the arch-villain of the piece? We now have evidence to suggest that it is he, Porphyro, who is in fact under a spell and enthralled by Madeleine, and who, like a witness to a magic trick, gazes upon her empty dress like an audience who have just witnessed a magical disappearance. And this returns us to a theme I mentioned in part 1 of this analysis. Who is enthralling whom? Who is under whose spell? Is Madeleine blinkered and hoodwinked by the imagined power of the ritual she has performed? Or is it she, the beautiful enchantress, who has, metaphorically, entranced Porphyro to her bedside? Or has the real trickery still to take place as Porphyro leaves his hiding place and will, in a few stanzas' time, perform a magical substitution with his fantasy self? These questions will remain long after your reading of the poem is finished, and I'll come back to them, I'm sure, before too long. But for now, let's return to the action of the poem. Now, in order to creep from where Porphyro is hiding without disturbing Madeleine, Porphyro listens carefully to Madeleine's breathing and breathes himself in time with her. The simile, which I've identified here, emphasises Porphyro's cautionary approach by comparing his fear of waking Madeleine in this incredibly intimate scene to the fear one might experience in a wide wilderness. He then silently walks over the carpet to her bed and peeps through the curtains. I've included a picture of the sort of bed that this is to help you imagine it. Sleeping in a bed with curtains isn't something many people do these days, but it's behind these curtains that Porphyro sees Madeleine fast asleep. In the next part of the poem, Porphyro prepares for the feast, which is an integral part of the Agnes myth and therefore an integral part of Porphyro's plan to become the real-life manifestation of it. This section of the poem is another one which is jam-packed with sensory details, from the smooth feel of the bed linen to the smell of lavender to the sweet-tasting food, which I'll go into in just a moment. He sets a table by the side of Madeleine's bed, and upon it throws a cloth of woven crimson, gold, and jet. More of those heraldic colours that I mentioned before. The word woven could easily be passed over here, but I think you need to make a note of it and link it to line 296 for reasons that I'll get to in a few minutes. But for now, let's move on to the next line, where Porphyro appears to wish for some drowsy Morphean amulet. Morpheus is a Greek god associated with sleep and in particular dreams, while an amulet is a charm usually worn as a necklace which is believed to have magical properties. As Madeleine is already asleep, it must be Porphyro wishes that he had such a charm so that he could sleep and join Madeleine in the dream world. And it's worth pointing out here that this is surely the final and ultimate barrier between the two lovers which Porphyro is wishing to cross. First, there were the moors which separated the castle from the place where Porphyro lives. Then there's the physical barrier of the castle itself, which he somehow gains access to. Then there's Madeleine's room, her wardrobe, and now her dreams. It's also worth noting the increasing sense of silence, intimacy, and isolation which creeps into this stanza. The moon, which had shone so brightly throughout the poem, is now faded. The sounds of the party are now far heard and in dying tones. And although Porphyro is briefly startled by the noise, he hears the sounds of the guests departing, and all the noise is gone. Meanwhile, Madeleine is still asleep, with the azure glow from the stained glass falling on her closed eyelids. The content of this and half of the following stanza is simply concerned with the feast which Porphyro brings from the closet and places on the table beside Madeleine's bed. The description creates the impression of rich and exotic foods with lucent syrups tincted with cinnamon needing to be read almost with the tip of our tongues to enhance the sense of refined delicacy. The foods, Keats tells us, have been brought in merchant ships, these argosies, from romantically alluring places in Africa and Asia. Fez, which is a city in Morocco, Samarkand, one of the oldest cities in Uzbekistan, and Lebanon. The rich, descriptive detail of the preparations continues in stanza 31 with typical romantic excess. The delicate food is not placed, but heaped as if to overflowing in golden dishes and bright baskets wreathed in silver, while the luxuriously scented food fills the entire room with its perfume. We've got here the now familiar opposition of warmth and cold. In this stanza too, Porphyro's hand is glowing despite the chilly room. And with the preparations made, all that remains is for him to wake Madeleine up. And so the voice of Porphyro is heard in the otherwise quiet of the room. When he speaks, he addresses her as my seraph, which is the highest rank in the hierarchy of angels. And it's probably significant, bearing in mind what I've been saying throughout this pair of videos about the associations between youth and warmth, that the literal translation of seraph is burning one. He also calls her his heaven, and he her eremite, which means a sort of Christian hermit, a person who lives a solitary lifestyle for religious purposes. And the combined effect of this is of Porphyro's assertion that he has abandoned all earthly pleasures in order to focus his devotion solely on Madeleine. The final two lines of the stanza appears to offer Madeleine two scenarios, both of which result in a joining of the two lovers. Either Madeleine opens her eyes and joins Porphyro in the world of waking reality, or he will drowse beside her in the imagined fantasy of her dreams. The proximity between the two lovers increases further in the next stanza as we observe Porphyro's arms sinking into the pillow beside Madeleine, but she does not wake. The charm that Madeleine is under is as impossible to melt as an iced stream, another cold image which contrasts with the warmth of Porphyro's arm. The spell, notice the pattern of magical imagery again, is steadfast, which means firm. And so, the golden trays and platters of food continue to reflect their lustrous glow onto the carpet, unused. And Porphyro waits and thinks, and in so doing becomes entoiled in woofed fantasies. And for years I struggled to explain the phrase woofed fantasies to my students, as there just didn't seem to be an explanation anywhere of what the word woofed means. And then just recently I came across one which interpreted it as woven. Now this is where we can link back to the woven cloth of stanza 29, because the two expressions of the word woven in such proximity and under these circumstances does not just happen by chance, and together help to suggest that Porphyro is in the process of magically weaving his own spell to replace the one he's trying to wake Madeleine from. The word entoiled itself is also thematically important, as it means trapped or ensnared. Now, I've spoken before about this poem's concern with the dangers of enthralment or getting caught up so completely in a fantasy world that the reality of the situation becomes marginalised and forgotten, leading to destruction. Anyway, he comes out of his musings at the beginning of the next stanza, which is stanza 33, and tries another plan: to wake Madeleine with music. The use of music in this poem is an interesting thread to follow. If you think about the beginning of the poem, where the beadsman in his freezing chapel hears the silver snarling trumpets above, at the party gets going, to the timbrels and thronged resort of stanza 8, where the party's in full swing, to the far-heard clarinet of stanza 29, where Porphyro hears as the guests leave, to be replaced by the tune he now plays on the lute, which, if you remember, Angela told him he would find back in stanza 20. The tune which Porphyro plays is called La Belle d'un Sans Merci, which is interesting for a couple of different reasons. Firstly, because a few months after this poem was written, in the spring of 1819, Keats wrote a poem called La Belle d'un Sans Merci, and you can find my video on that poem on this channel. It's also interesting because of what the name of the tune translates as, which is The Beautiful Woman Without Mercy. And this brings us back to one of the poem's enduring questions, which I discussed a few minutes ago and which comes up so many times. Who is seducing whom? In Keats's poem of this name, a knight finds a beautiful woman on a hillside and is enchanted, seduced, and ultimately destroyed by her. He's lulled to sleep, and in a nightmare sees all of the other men who have fallen victim to this same beautiful woman. In both of these poems, the real world combines with fantasy. In both poems, a man is in love with a woman. There is food in both, and dreams, and death. So is Keats giving his clearest indication yet that Porphyro is as much a victim of enthralment here as Madeleine? Whatever the answer, the song has the desired effect, and Madeleine begins to wake. Firstly, by uttering a soft moan, perhaps an influence for the sweet moan issued by the enchantress in Keats's La Belle d'un Sans Merci. Then, by a quickening of her breath, followed quickly by her blue, afraid eyes, wide open shone. And at this, Porphyro sinks to his knees, and the simile used in this line is fascinating as it compares Porphyro to one of the freezing statues in the chapel at the beginning of the poem. which is how he will stay for the duration of the next 18 lines of poetry. And this image of pale, sculptured stone will compare unfavourably with the vision of Porphyro that Madeleine has just been awoken from. Over the next 3 stanzas, the fusion of dreams and reality will climax, in more ways than one. Firstly, we see that despite Madeleine's eyes now being wide awake, she still beheld the vision of her sleep. In other words, just for a moment, she sees the face of her dream lover on the body of the real thing. But the punctuation at the end of this line is used by Keats to signal a change. As Madeleine enters a more wakeful state and the vision of her sleep fades, there was a painful change in what she sees, which almost completely gets rid of the pure, deep and blissful dream she was having. Madeleine is so upset and disappointed by this change that she begins to cry and moan unintelligibly while still gazing at Porphyro, who remains on his knees with his hands joined together like a praying statue. And now Madeleine speaks to him, and she says how she heard the sweet tremble of his singing in her dream, and saw his clear and spiritual eyes, which now appear so sad. The central line in this stanza is one of the most straightforward. Madeleine says, "How changed thou art, how pallid, chill and drear." And this focalises one of the poem's key ideas, which is the sense of cold reality when compared to the world of fantasy and dreams. The adjective pallid, which she uses to describe him, means pale, while drear means gloomy or cheerless. Not exactly how a lover would wish to be described, but these observations from Madeleine are born out of a comparison with an unrealistic vision of a dreamy perfection to which Porphyro has no hope of matching up. But Madeleine wants the vision of Porphyro back and begs him to "Give me that voice again, my Porphyro, those looks immortal, those complainings dear." For if she cannot return him to that state of being, then Madeleine will remain in eternal sadness and feel lost. The beginning of the final line of this stanza is interesting with the conditional phrase, "For if thou diest, my love, I know not where to go." For if thou diest. But there's no threat to Porphyro's life at this point in the poem. The explanation, of course, is that Madeleine is still addressing the image of Porphyro from her dream, and it is that which she fears losing to a kind of death and being left with the cold, statuesque reality in front of her. Porphyro's reaction to what appears to be criticism from his lover is interesting. He is impassioned, aroused, and despite, by modern standards at least, the careful treatment by Keats of the act which take place in this stanza, he very nearly lost his publisher due to the overt sexual description. The words arose, flushed and throbbing are clear enough to describe Porphyro's arousal beyond a mortal man, while the metaphorical "into her dream he melted" both captures the moment of penetration and also hinting at Porphyro's belief that this is how he can recapture for Madeleine the vision he has awoken her from. The question is Is the solution sweet, consensual, or forced? Does Madeleine know what she is doing, or does she believe she is still under the influence of her dream? Certainly, there are some ominous images, both after the caesura which cuts through and redirects our attention in this line, and at the end of the poem, while dreams and fantasy mix with heat and passion inside the room, outside there is a frost wind blowing. Sharp sleet, and St Agnes moon has set, symbolically indicating that the charm is now over and it's time to face up to reality. The following stanza opens in similarly ominous tone with images of darkness and cold, and only now does Porphyro remove the blinkers completely from Madeleine's eyes by saying, "This is no dream." The repetition of the opening words of this stanza, together with further reminders of the icy storm raging outside, separate these words from Madeleine's response and so increase the ominous tone. The structure and organisation of these lines also serves to force the existence of the outside world onto the consciousness of the young lovers. They cannot stay in this room forever, and soon they will have to confront the consequences of their actions. Madeleine expresses a range of emotions through this dialogue, from her initial shock and upset, alas, to fear at being abandoned and rejected by Porphyro. Porphyro will leave me here to fade and pine, to anger about what has happened to her. Cruel, she says, what traitor could thee hither bring? She describes herself as a deceived thing, which certainly lends support to the argument that Madeleine didn't really know what she was doing, that sex was not consensual, and that Madeleine believed at the time that she was still dreaming. Despite this, she says that she will not curse Porphyro for his actions. She says that still my heart is lost in thine, although the word lost might indicate that Madeleine is still more in love with the romantic, idealised vision of him from her dreams than the real deal. The final image in this stanza is, in fact, the final thing that Madeleine will say in the whole poem, and it expresses her fear for what the future may hold for her. The pattern of bird images associated with Madeleine continues, and here she describes herself as a dove, forlorn with lost with sick, unpruned wings. Forlorn is easily understood as meaning both sad and abandoned, while the wings which birds use to gain freedom from the nest, remember that image from earlier, are sick, suggesting that the only way Madeleine will now be able to escape is with Porphyro. For his part, Porphyro appears to have honourable intent. In the first line of the next stanza, he calls Madeleine his bride, and then asks whether he can forever be her vassal blessed. And the word vassal has a couple of different meanings relevant to this context, one being servant or slave, but another has connotations of enthrallment. And so, in this interpretation, Porphyro is asking Madeleine whether he can remain forever under her spell. He compares her to a silver shrine, and himself a famished pilgrim who has toiled for many hours to be with her. He even makes reference to the magical or miraculous means by which he was able to not only gain access to the castle, but also Madeleine's bedchamber. And the religious imagery continues in the final line of the stanza, where Porphyro claims that he is no rude infidel, where infidel means non-Christian. In other words, Porphyro is a Christian who has come to worship at the shrine that is Madeleine, that she should trust him to behave honourably. And Porphyro has asserted a number of times in this poem that he's not a bad person. The bird metaphor is used again in this verse in the line, "I will not rob thy nest, saving of thy sweet self," which seems to mean I won't take anything from the nest except you, which on the surface at least appears to be a contradiction since she's the only person in it, but I think the best way of explaining this is to emphasise the word rob, which the iambic line encourages us to do anyway. And if you couple this with what I've already said about the way Porphyro asks Madeleine to trust him in the final line, then you get a sense of what he is asking her to do, which is to go with him willingly rather than under any duress. He tells Madeleine that they should escape the castle now, quickly, as it's close to morning, and that he has a home for her across the moors. He says that there are several things which will aid their escape. The partygoers will have eaten loads, they'll be bloated and therefore will not wake to hear them. They will also have drunk loads of wine and beer, and also, and most interestingly, the storm, which might appear wild or haggard, but will in fact do them a favour, a boon, in masking the sounds of their escape. What's interesting about this is that Porphyro chooses to describe it as an elfin storm from fairyland. All other description of the storm so far has been in much more realistic language. The frost wind blowing, the floor-blown sleet, the iced gusts and the sharp sleet of the last few stanzas are all from the perspective of the poet-narrator, Keats. This is the first time it's acknowledged by either of the lovers, and Porphyro still needs to focus Madeleine's attention on it through the word hark, which means listen. It could be argued that this language suggests that the lovers have attained a state with one another where all other considerations are marginalised through their dream-like happiness, perhaps even transcending mortality, as some critics have suggested, and there is more evidence of this in a minute. What Keats is certainly hinting at through this description is that the lovers have seriously underestimated the danger that the storm, both in its literal and metaphorical state, could bring them. The pace increases over the next stanza as the action intensifies through the lovers' escape from the castle. Madeleine hurries despite her fears. The sleeping dragons in line 2 are metaphorical ones, but it is interesting to pick up on this pattern of real danger. In other words, the guests, guards and other members of the household being associated with elements from fantasy, just like the storm in the previous stanza. The castle is dark, and the fire-lighted lamps flicker by each door. An arras is a hanging tapestry, and this is decorated with other images from heraldry: horseman, hawk and hound. And this flutters in the wind as the storm continues to force its way into the castle, in the same way that the carpet on the floor rises up along the gusty floor, all indicating that the lovers are getting closer to the outside world. I said a moment ago that some critics comment on the exit of the two lovers from the castle as suggesting that they have transcended mortality and entered an otherworldly state of being through the realization of their shared fantasy. And there is certainly something magical and fantastical about the way that Keats describes the final stages of their exit from the castle in the penultimate stanza. Firstly, they glide is repeated twice, along with the simile like phantoms, which makes us imagine two ghostly figures floating silently through the medieval castle. They pass the porter, who's a sort of doorman, sprawled out with a huge empty flagon by his side. A flagon, by the way, is a sort of container for drink, about 2 pints worth, so clearly he won't be waking up to prevent their exit. But perhaps even more fortunately, miraculously, or even magically, the guard dog, a bloodhound, does wake up, sees them, but does nothing more than shake his hide. And the reason for the dog not raising the alarm is that his sagacious eye an inmate owns. The word sagacious means wise, while inmate reminds us perhaps of prisoners. And in fact, when you look at this stanza, there are several images which might remind us of a prison. And I've highlighted them in green here: the iron porch, the sliding bolts, chains, keys, and groaning hinges. And so the reason that the dog doesn't react seems to be that it's wise enough to recognise a fellow inmate and is calmed. The castle continues to help the lovers with their escape as the bolts slide easily and the chains are silent as they open the door, and they are gone, fled away into the storm, which has been used by Keats in the last 7 stanzas to represent the world outside the fantasy, a kind of harsh reality which the lovers may not even survive. I've certainly read critics who've interpreted the line, "they are gone," as suggesting that the lovers may have perished in the storm. Personally, I prefer the former interpretation, where the lovers survive but now need to deal with the circumstances that the world has thrown at them, the fact that life really isn't a dream. The critic Clifford Alderman writes that the ending of the poem is significant as the two lovers are the only characters in the poem who break out of the state of enthralment he believes all of them to be under. The beadsman through his religious beliefs, Porphyro through his romantic attitude, Madeleine through the myth of the St Agnes ritual, and Angela through her loyalty to Porphyro. Only the lovers break out of the entrapping state of dreams and head off into the storm of reality. He argues that they achieve this by, in his words, actualising the visionary experience, and I'm assuming that he has stanza 36 in mind here. It is certainly true that Keats, the poet-narrator, distances us and himself from the lovers in the final stanza by making them disappear before our eyes, and then by saying that these events all happened ages long ago. But the ending is far from being empty. empty of dreams. Keats tells us that night the Baron dreamt of many a woe, while all the warrior guests at the party had nightmares of witches, demons, and large coffin worms, almost as if they remain under some sort of curse after the lovers have fled. Keats then tells us the fate of the two old characters, Angela the Old, who died palsy-twitched, and the beadsman, whose introduction began the poem some 380 lines ago, slept among his ashes cold. So he's dead too. And not only that, but the 1,000 prayers he has said for the souls of other people have been for nothing. They were never asked for in the first place. The deaths of these two characters is mentioned briefly, and some have said rather callously. So it's easy to see why some critics read the end of this poem as being very sad and even tragic. The final images, after all, are all of age, death, storms, and that final word, cold. And yet, perhaps the romantic in me chooses to read it in a more optimistic way than this. Perhaps, as Andrew Motion said, it represents the idea of progress from one generation to another, and a love story where youth triumphs over age. By fleeing the castle, the lovers have, like Romeo and Juliet, escaped the social conflict that is the backdrop to the poem and set up a new life in the home Porphyro has promised for her, in a place where idealised love is celebrated. It's impossible to ignore the metaphorical significance of the storm into which the lovers have escaped, and Keats is ambiguous about resolving this and other conflicts within the poem. And yet, with his own conflicting views about relationships, for me at least, this is exactly as it should be.